Welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to add my welcome to you, Jill's, for our online briefing today. As you all know, Friday's announcement by the Department of Education rescinding the 2011 Dear Colleague letter and the 2014 Q&A guidance has campuses around the country looking at how they can manage this new information that we really have to quickly digest. Before we get started, I wanted to share that NASPA has an incredible amount of resources for all of you outside this webinar as we navigate these changes in federal guidance together. They include the RPI blog, which includes blogs exploring the policy implications of recent events on Title IX and campus violence, the newly formed Sexual and Relationship Violence Prevention, Education, and Response Knowledge Community, which you can connect with by indicating your interest in your NASPA profile, and they are also on Facebook and LinkedIn. And finally, the Cultural Respect Program, which is hosting a live briefing on October 3rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, outlining how and why your institution might be involved in this program. And now on to this afternoon. We definitely have a distinguished panel with us today to discuss an initial analysis and talk about next steps as the student affairs profession determines how we can support students through this turbulent time. We have Tanya Jachimiak, Title IX coordinator at Wake Forest University, as today's moderator. And I'm going to turn it over to her to get this started in this important discussion. Tanya?
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank NASPA for offering this webinar and providing us a platform to explore the next steps that campuses may or should consider in light of last Friday's announcement by the Department of Education. Before we begin, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves. As mentioned, my name is Tanya Jachimiak, and I'm the director of the Title IX office and Title IX coordinator at Wake Forest University. And if we could just go and start with Dr. Lawrence Ward, and we'll go from there.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Ward. I'm the Vice President for Student Affairs and the Dean of Students at Babson College in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I also serve as chair of NASPA's Public Policy Division.
Thank you. Wanda?
Yes, hello. I am Wanda Swan, and I serve as the director of the Respect Program within the Office of Health Promotion at Emory University.
Jill?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jill Creighton. I'm the president of the Association for Student Conduct Administration. We're the co-sponsor for today's webinar. And the Association for Student Conduct Administration represents about 3,000 student conduct professionals in 11 countries and about 1,200 unique institutions.
Great. Welcome, everyone. So today we're here to discuss the September 22nd, 2017 Dear Colleague letter and the question and answer document that was issued by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. The Dear Colleague letter rescinded the April 4th, 2011 Dear Colleague letter, as well as the April 29th, 2014 Q&A document that was previously issued by the OCR. It also reiterated that there would be a reliance by the OCR on the 2001 revised sexual harassment guidelines, as well as the 2006 Dear Colleague letter. There are a couple of key points to keep in mind as we discuss this new guidance. First off, the new guidance removes the obligation of institutions to utilize the preponderance of evidence standard, otherwise known as the more likely than not standard. It removes the obligations that universities complete their investigations within 60 days. It also opens up the door that institutions may rely upon police investigations. It removes the prohibition that informal resolutions may be utilized, essentially allowing, when appropriate, allowing universities to utilize a mediation approach in instances of sexual assault. It allows for universities' policies to provide appeal rights to accused parties, even if it does not offer those appeal rights to victims or complainants. It opens the door to cross-examination by both parties. And it also reiterates that Title IX, any of our Title IX policies should afford rights to both parties, regardless of what their status may be, either as the victim or as the accused party. Now, despite reaffirming basic fairness and the requirement that all of our policies offer basic fairness, they do raise quite a few questions that we will explore here, such as what are universities' responsibilities vis-a-vis off-campus complaints, what investigation models should be utilized, how will the OCR evaluate complaints regarding issues of sexual orientation. So those are just some of the few questions that it raises. But let's start with the question regarding current challenges. What are the greatest challenges that exist in the panel's roles given the new guidance? And any one of you may start off with answering that question.
I think I'll go ahead and kick us off. One of the things that I'm seeing is a very quick response from a lot of organizations, NASPA and ASCA included. But the guidance in itself that was reissued last week is interim guidance. And so as we look at our policies and as we look at the things that are mandated and taken away and re-included, we need to remember that this guidance is not and should not be considered final. And it is simply the interim as we wait for negotiated rulemaking, the open comment period to occur. And so it's giving us some deference as some institutions to look at our current policies. But I think the biggest challenge is as an institution or as institutions of higher education, we should not be completely reactionary into looking at the musts and the woulds and the shoulds of the letter, but instead going, are our processes sound? Are they still prompt and equitable? Do they still offer the bases of fundamental fairness and due process that we already owe our students? And as we look at what schools were doing prior to the 2014 and 2011 letters, we are still more than likely offering prompt and equitable processes to our students based on that 01 guidance. So we know that 80% of institutions were already compliant when the 2011 letter came into effect. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of change. And so I think a lot of it is managing expectations.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think, from a campus perspective, the most challenging part of gender-based misconduct hasn't changed, irrespective of the recent rescinding of the Dear Colleague letter. It's how do you continue to offer a fair process, a process that's transparent, a process that's effective, when normally two eyewitnesses vastly disagree about what happened. And so I think the fundamental challenge of addressing this issue, at least from an adjudication standpoint, remains. That I feel continues to be a challenge, but fundamentally, our policies don't change. Our commitment to the issue, to having a safe and secure campus environment, for saying that we believe you, that commitment doesn't change as a result of last Friday's actions.
All right, I also agree with that. I think the role of that I bring to this as a director, as well as an advocate, is one where as a director, I definitely agree with the idea that these are interim measures, and it does allow us the opportunity to have much needed conversation and have these check-in opportunities with our campus entities to ensure and to reassure our place and our stake and our commitment to our students. I think as an advocate, it is a very different I have a very different role, because as an advocate, my role is to filter in every possible instance that could be perceived as a potential threat to the success of survivors, right? And so that is a very different role that I take. And so with that hat, I am constantly thinking about the challenge of actually balancing the institutional and federal ties that I have with my job, with the individual interactions and support that I have with survivors, and the language and the questions, because I am also on the front lines in a different way with students, with survivors, and who are also hearing these these statements and are coming into offices with fear, right? And we have to call it what it is, and I have to have these honest conversations of some of the language that is hurtful to or potentially hurtful, right? And the language that was even used by DeVos in the press conference, the language that was it seemed to create two subcultures of victimhood, right? So we have those who are impacted by violence and those who are falsely accused, right? And so and those are the only two groups that exist on our college campuses. And so I think that the conversation around who's actually harming, and we're not talking about, there's not a lot of language or I feel like a lot of guidance around what are we doing with this gap, because there could be this perceived this perception that there are no offenders on campus, right? Because a lot of the conversation was either there are victims here and there are victims there, and we're not actually talking about what specifically happens on college campus and how the root cause of violence actually plays into that. So those are some things that I have to continuously turn over. I think that the language is ultimately not completely survivor-centered, and it's not completely trauma-informed in the interim. And so those are some things. And as an advocate, right, I know that in knowing all these things, I know that my work does not stop. Like advocates like myself and others across the country, we have to sit in a small room with survivors, and we have to build rapport, and we have to tell them their rights, and we have to validate their experiences and let them know all about all their options, and reassure them that the institution is looking to support, and we are here to provide support every step of the way. But when these questions are here, even in the interim around the system that we're beholden to, students can feel that the language does not align, survivors specifically does not align with their best interests. So those are things that I keep in mind.
Do any of the panelists have concerns regarding the removal of the 60-day deadline for investigations?
I think the language of prompt and equitable is still in that 2001 guidance, and I think that's a standard by which we still need to be abiding. I actually think that a lot of campuses will feel that they have a little bit of breathing room about that 60-day limit being removed. Many campuses have varying levels of resources. So for example, a small underfunded public institution might only have one person doing all of the work related to Title IX, whereas a large public land grant might have an office of 10. And so what that 60-day window means is very different for different campuses, especially when school breaks come up or if people's processes require panels to be assembled over breaks. I think that 60 days removal actually gives us a little bit of deference as institutions to do what works best for our campuses.
Mm-hmm.
Here. I couldn't have said it better, so I won't try to. The only thing I will say is, as a relatively small campus, if you have multiple cases going on at the same time and a limited staff, that 60 days was hard to meet, almost impossible to meet. And I think managing those expectations for the complainant, for the respondent, was incredibly difficult. So I do think it gives a degree of flexibility, but not a license to drag our feet by any measure.
I agree.
I would agree, especially since some of these cases could be rather complex, and when there's multiple cases, that 60 days could be very limiting, especially when an investigation may require longer than 60 days to gather all the evidence and information.
I will also add that there's always kind of been a bit of a fog over when day one of 60 is. Is it the date that we find out about an alleged incident? Is it the date that a complainant decides to go forward with a complaint? Is it somewhere in between there? And is it the date that the university decides to move forward with the complaint? That's never been particularly clear. And so again, I think that lift is giving us a little bit of deference to use good judgment.
And Jim, I'm glad that you brought that up, Jill, because that is also something that we we within my department or within my staff, that is also a conversation, right? This idea of 60, the idea of the 60-day, I think the idea of that specific number was problematic, is problematic. But I do think that what we lost is a lot more clarity around accountability measures. And that is something that I'm concerned with in the interim, I think overall. If it's not 60, been doing this work for quite some time, getting it wrapped up in 60, man, you get a gold star, because that is, But but I think the question that I have is, and this is a question that I remember having when I sat there and I read it, or I sat there and I listened to the boss. I'm like, okay, so what is it? So what's coming? So give me something, And I think at this point, I am very, for me, I'm looking at what is, because I also know, like I've been doing this work before the 2011 Dear Colleague came out, and I also know that if there is not enough weight in place, what that does and what impact that causes survivors, and that is a huge concern of mine.
Wanda, what has your institutional response been to the new Dear Colleague letters?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yes. What has your institution's response been?
Right. So as it relates to response, I think that we're fortunate, and I'll say that, being that we are a private institution, and that allows us some flexibility with our language and also with our actions. We're fortunate to have forward-facing leadership with our Dean of Campus Life, Jay Nair, who has come out and made statements and restate the university's commitment to prevention, advocacy, and response, right? And he has stated a continued commitment publicly to enforcing our policy, as well as leaning on the expertise of those who are poised to do the work, and to continue leading and contributing to the conversations. We are at a place, I think, where we are a week out. So we are info gathering, we are sharing, we are having lots of conversations, but I'm positive and I'm enthused by the support that we're getting both publicly and behind our computers and behind our office doors for the most part. Yeah.
Great. Jill or Larry, how about your institutions?
So I think what we're seeing, at least, so I'm based in New York State for my full-time role, but in New York State and also in California, what we saw was codifying through our state legislatures a lot of the requirements that were put forward in the 2011 and 2014 Dear Colleague letters. So what I'm seeing from institutions in those two states is really no changes at all, because those requirements, including education and training, including time limits on investigations, reporting, all of those things, those are state laws now. And so there's not a lot of changes happening in New York and California.
Yeah, we haven't made any changes, any policy changes, and right now don't see the need to make any policy changes. We've sent out to our campus community, both students, faculty, and staff, a statement of reassurance that we continue to be fully committed to a safe and secure environment, to training, to education, to prevention, to effective response. So for us, I think it was important to communicate clearly with the campus community our continued commitment and dedication to this. But there really haven't been any changes. We have a Title IX committee that meets regularly on campus once a month, and we've gathered that group and started an initial set of discussions, trying to imagine what might be coming next, right? So is this telegraphing changes? But really, until those changes become clear, this is, I guess, what we call a repeal with no replace.
And we did the same. Our vice president, Penny Rue, and I issued a statement regarding Wake Forest's continuing and steadfast commitment to providing a work and academic environment that's free from sex discrimination and sexual misconduct. Have any of you heard from students? What has been their response?
So it's really interesting. Our students have been pretty active, I think is the word, within the last semester or a year, because we have been, as a state, working with similar language in Georgia's House Bill 51. So they've been very active in making their presence felt, I think, both here on campus as well as the Capitol. And I think there's actually been a surge of collaboration from advocacy peer groups across institutions in Georgia, actually, and I think that's given us the opportunity to offer support when they feel that is necessary. But we have a large base of active students, both as a larger collective, as well as Emory students who are poised and ready with questions and are exercising their rights to ask those questions in public spaces, as well as educate each other. I supervise, or I advise, nobody supervises them. I advise a student group, sexual assault peer advocates, who have really took a large chunk of last semester at connecting with our community entities and advocacy programs, YWCA, to come out and to come into the campus and to provide education on what legislation around Title IX looks like on a local level, what changes could look like for the state of Georgia. And so there's a level of engagement that they've already been a part of. So that is something that I enjoy seeing from my side of the table.
I can share an anecdote. I'm aware of one institution that had a former respondent who had been found responsible through a fair and equitable process, who had graduated a couple of years ago, reached back out to that institution to say, I heard this announcement, I'm really unsure how this might affect me and what happened to me in the process a couple of years ago. Can you please offer clarity? So I think that although the main message behind the effort of the letter from last week was to offer additional clarity, there has been some confusion from students in terms of what's going on and how it affects their cases, their past cases, their future cases. But in particular, it struck me because the student had been graduated for 2 years.
That's interesting. I think for us, it's been relatively quiet from a student perspective. I think if I could sort of characterize what have heard, it's really the question, so what does this all mean? And that's just a difficult question to try to answer right now. It's easier to answer what it doesn't mean in terms of our commitment, but hard to answer what does it all mean.
Right, and we've had a similar response from our students, and actually it's increased requests from many of our fraternity members in terms of they're requesting to become more involved with prevention efforts. So that's a great thing that's happened, because we definitely want all genders to be involved with prevention efforts. How about from your colleagues, from others, from faculty or other staff? Have there been any concerns expressed by them?
The conduct officer community is very tight. We are often solo shops on many of our campuses, so all of us were kind of virtually having our own watch parties as the announcements came out. And I think that the initial reactions were a little bit of confusion. The initial reactions were, okay, now let me look at my policies. But ultimately, what we're really seeing is kind of a sense of, okay, let's keep calm and carry on. We're going to be okay. We're going to keep offering fair and equitable processes to our students. We're going to continue to be prompt. We're going to continue to offer fundamental fairness. So we know that we're going to be steadfast in continuing to advocate for the rights of both parties or all parties in a sexual misconduct proceeding or a Title IX proceeding. That's always been our goal, to treat every student with fairness, respect, and dignity, and always to hear every case before we decide it. So we're not changing any of that. The standards that we've been setting forth over the last couple of years haven't really changed all that much in the last 30 years in terms of what we've asked our conduct officer community to do for our campuses. So in that, we remain very steadfast, but we are certainly a little bit concerned about having our voices at the table as the practitioners who run these processes as the federal government makes those changes.
Yeah, I would just add, I think, Buddy, sometimes, particularly with faculty and colleagues, they tend to look at the folks who on our campus who are closest to our Title IX infrastructure, and they sort of look to us for cues. And so, not that I have any hair to pull out, but if you're not running around pulling out your hair, if you're calm and steady and saying, you know, regardless of what comes down the line, we remain committed. We remain committed to doing the right things, even when things get difficult. So I think our students and our faculty and other colleagues are watching how we react and taking their cues from that. And so I think for those who are listening to the webinar, I think it's important to you very often can set the tone for how your campus and how your student body will react to this based on your reaction. So if you communicate reassurance, commitment, dedication to doing the right things, those are the messages that I think students pay the closest attention to.
I found that I think as it relates to advocates, similar to what Jill stated, we are very tight. We're a very tight knit group of folks, and we are. What is the right word? We are very enthusiastic about doing the work necessary to figure out how we can best position ourselves and also position the support and these stories that we hold, right, and the work that we do in a way that creates a better atmosphere and a better space. I think of CAPA, the Campus Advocacy and Professional Prevention Professionals Association that I'm a part of, is one group who's been very active in using its collective voice to issue statements on both the boss's initial press conference as well as the recent rollout. And they are an organization, a group who intends to have and supports survivor-centered presence during possible notice and comment period or the negotiated rulemaking process. I think about NASPA's own KC, Sexual and Relationship Violence Prevention, Education and Response Knowledge Community. A lot of those, both of those spaces overlap, and so we're having folks in those spaces as well using their collective platforms to try to amplify voices. But I think it's concern. I am sincerely downplaying, and I feel like I'm not doing enough showing of the concern that we have. This is scary. This is a scary time for us because, like I said earlier, a lot of us have been working in this field before. A lot of the, advocacy has been present longer than Title IX, right? This concept of advocacy as a profession, whether it is a paid one or not, has always been here. And so this is something that is of great concern to us as a collective and as individual professionals. And so it is a conversation that is ever turning, and it is a conversation that we are always interested in having and interested in being at the table and figuring out how we can best put our voice forward to ensure that the care and the support of survivors are also centered in these decision-making processes.
We have a question from our audience regarding informal resolution, and the question is, regarding informal resolution, doesn't the 2001 guidance prohibit this in instances of sexual violence, even if this point was more clearly made in 2011?
Yes, the 2001 guidance does, but informal resolution does not always equate to mediation. So conflict resolution is a spectrum. There's a large number of tools in that conflict resolution toolbox, of which mediation is one and formal adjudication is another. But between that, we also have things like shuttle diplomacy. We have things like facilitated dialogue and conflict negotiation and coaching and things like that. Because oftentimes, I'm sure that you've all seen this in your campuses, a respondent will come to the table and say, I don't know what happened. And a complainant will come to the table and say, I just need to tell someone, but I don't want anything to happen to the respondent. And that would be often the key that would prevent that complainant from filing that formal complaint. And so the informal resolution toolbox opens the door for the complainant in some ways to have a say in how the complaint gets resolved. But mediation is different than just saying conflict resolution or informal resolution. So I think that's really important to remember. In a mediation pure context, in the true definition of mediation, all parties are taking some sort of accountability for their role in a situation. And we know with sexual assault, with the dynamic of power and control and violence, there is no blame on the part of the survivor. And so that's why mediation is in itself inappropriate for sexual violence cases, but can be more appropriate for other types of Title IX interventions that don't involve that level of direct violence.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Well done.
How about you?
No, I mean, I'm with Wanda. I think can't improve upon Jill's answer.
Great. We have another question. Does anyone know where or how to find what portions of the Dear Colleague letter may have been codified in your state to help speak to the changes we may see?
This is very state by state. So for ASCA members, we actually have state level coordinators that are responsible for tracking legislation in their state that impact the work of student conduct officers. So if you are an ASCA member, I would really encourage you to reach out to your ASCA state coordinator. They're going to be the best resource to teach you how to find what's going on with your state legislature, because every state's website is set up a little bit differently. Every state has a different process for how they allow things to come to the floors of their state legislatures and be voted on, and committees work differently. So it's very difficult, but you can on the federal level register for alerts through the Federal Register, which I encourage everyone to do to keep up on what's going on.
Right, and to the extent that you can, speak with your outside counsel, who should be able to help you navigate through the waters of state law.
Yeah, or your general counsel and Title IX coordinator often are well positioned to provide that state by state or state level guidance, I really should say.
Our next question is with regard to the role of alumni in prevention efforts. The question is there a role for alumni in helping set the tone and encouraging campuses who might not have as strong a commitment to survivor support?
I think short answer is always going to be yes. Because as we look at, I tell my students often that I am quite charming and I am an awesome human, but we will never have a social relationship. We should not, and we cannot. The Respect program would not end violence on Emory University's campus. You know, we're 3 people. We're a 3-person staff, and our job is to we bill ourselves as change agent trainers, right? And so we are looking and hoping that there will be that answer to our call out within our campus community. We're also a campus with a very active alumni, and we are a campus who enjoys that relationship with our alums. The Respect program within itself, we have an alumni association called RPAN, right? Respect Program Alumni Network, and we celebrate and we try to support those who have either worked here or have volunteered within our groups. But we appreciate that, and we're using those opportunities to speak more about how some of the decision making, or even some of the support that they are spreading throughout the university, how that can be utilized in a different way to support some efforts. So I think that is, if we're talking about opportunities, yes, I think that there's always an opportunity for alums to utilize the relationship that they have with the universities to help. Honestly, it's about normalizing. Like, let's normalize the culture change, right? And we need all the help that we can get to do that. So I say the more the merrier. Bring everybody.
Well, and to build on that, for alumni, I would really encourage alumni to work with their local kind of spheres of influence. If you have children, start having that conversation about consent really early. Oftentimes when we see first-year students coming to our campuses, what we're really doing is trying to undo 18 years worth of attitudes towards consent and healthy sexual behavior. And it's a very hard thing to do. We're being asked as college campuses often to help steer the ship forward towards, kind of working towards eliminating rape culture in society. And we're a microcosm of our greater society. So alumni can really help by having those conversations with the people that they're close to, with the people in their office spaces, et cetera, because this is not just a problem on college campuses.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a campus-wide effort. But as I sat here listening to the answers to this question, I guess it could cut both ways too, because you could have a large or even a vocal group of committed alumni who really want the college to go backwards in some of their efforts, who feel as though that there are two categories of victims in this. And so you could have a very vocal alumni group. You could have a very vocal group of donors who put pressure on the college to change dramatically from their course. And so I think we probably, at least I don't worry about that on my campus necessarily, but it could be a dynamic here. We didn't get to this point, just by accident. There's a lot of people who voted for this administration, and so I think we have to be prepared to be committed to doing the right things, whether that is popular among alumni or not.
And for those schools who may be looking for a type of actionable framework for including alumni within their prevention efforts, I want to put a plug out there for NASPA's Culture of Respect. Mm-hmm. Their leadership team for each of the schools involves alumni, students, faculty, and staff. So for those institutions who are looking for that type of framework, I want to highly recommend looking at NASPA's Culture of Respect.
Yeah, when we have training and education programs, if we have a group called Peers on Wellness, who do a lot around peer advocacy. If they're having a program, extending those invitations to alums to come back on campus and learn about our efforts, particularly around training, education, prevention, I think that's critically important to inviting more people into the conversation.
So the next question is with regard to appeals. The question is, could you square the appeals information in the new question and answer document and Clery VAWA regs?
So I've got some paperwork in front of me. I'm going to dig into that for a moment so I'm quoting this correctly. If you could see my desk, I've got the 2011 letter, 2001 letter, the Clery Act, the Federal Register, new guidance, etc. So give me a quick moment. So it is still permissible for both parties to be allowed an appeal. It's just not a requirement. And so one of the things that's really important to remember is that compliance is a floor, not a ceiling. So just because we don't have to do it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. One of the things with this interim guidance is that, again, I would caution institutions against making broad, sweeping, immediate changes, given that this is interim guidance. So if your process already allows for both parties to appeal, you should consider why you would eliminate that. You could consider how that plays a role in fundamental fairness and an equitable and prompt resolution of a process like this. So it's something that campuses should really weigh carefully. There's no harm in adding more process available to students involved. There's there's not a reason to take something away legitimately. If there's not a reason to take something away, the campus should consider why they're doing that. So again, this is not saying that we can't do it. It's just saying that we don't have to. We're not mandated.
Right, and one of the key points that runs throughout is that we ensure fairness, and we ensure that if we are offering appeals rights to one party, we also offer to the other party. And so it's just really important that we afford all parties the same rights, and the same rights and opportunities.
Agree. I actually think it makes us better decision makers when both parties have the ability to appeal.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, especially if we're looking at interim language that is only giving that benefit to a respondent. That is, yeah. I speak in sound sometimes when yes. So that was yeah. Yes. We can move on.
Tanya, would you mind if I circled back real quickly to a previous question? I just had an additional thought about the informal resolution question.
Mm-hmm.
My brain forgot about restorative justice in that moment, and that's something that we should certainly mention. Restorative justice as an informal resolution method to sexual misconduct cases is something that's currently being piloted and experimented with around the country. Restorative justice practice has been used to help find voices for people who have been victimized. It's been used in cases of homicide. So it certainly is a potential resolution option for sexual misconduct cases, provided that everyone is voluntarily coming to that table. So it's something that there's a lot of training on right now, and we're not totally sure where the field will land on that, but it is certainly an informal resolution method that we would be remiss not to consider.
Thanks, Jill. The next question is, what are any thoughts you may have on messages that have been sent, statements in regards to their impact on normalization of violence, victim blaming, and myths around interpersonal violence?
Can you repeat that question?
Absolutely. What are folks' thoughts on the messages being sent by the current administration statements in regards to their impact on the normalization of violence, victim blaming, and myths around interpersonal violence?
So, I think that I'm filtering myself in complete honesty. I think that we are seeing, I think that we're seeing an administration who, honestly, in my professional opinion, the pendulum has just swung too far in the other direction. As Wanda Swan, human being, person who walks the street and lives life day in, day out, I think that we are conflating trauma with distress as it relates to experiences within the adjudication processes. I think we are punishing. I think this language can punish, has the unfortunate impact of punishing survivors and protecting those who are perceived unjustly accused. I think that's how I see where we are. I think that the language around this idea of, that I said earlier, protecting, working to create this balance. I think that there is I agree that equity has to be maintained, but I am wondering what definitions are we using? Like, I feel like that there is a lot of misleading information that was being used to actually bring this document to fruition in the way that it laid at our laps. And I think that if we are using the rhetoric of of the unjustly accused, of the due process, and of this idea of people being accused in systems that are not equitable, systems that are stacked against others. I am a believer of facts. I am a believer of evidence. I think that there has been a lot of misleading language and a lot of decisions that have been made that have not necessarily been informed in evidence-based strategies. And I think that that is what's so concerning for me, that this can quickly become a conversation around making sure that we do not interrupt the potential success of one person, and without thinking critically about the impact that another person's or persons' lives are just, we're not thinking in that way. So those are my personal opinions.
So on the note with regard to accused parties, a question came in regarding the requirement that a notice be issued in writing to the accused that includes a number of things, including the name of individuals involved in the complaint, as well as the specific details. Does anyone have any thoughts on the impact of these requirements on investigations?
So in a general investigation in good practice, any student who's coming in that is accused of violating a university policy has the right to know what policy they're accused of being in violation of and the incident in which they're being accused. So that would be standard whether it is a minor in possession of alcohol situation or a noise complaint in the residence halls or an aggravated assault or a Title IX case. So when I saw this requirement, I looked and really looked at what are we being asked to provide. We're being asked to provide the date and time and place where this incident allegedly occurred. We're being asked to provide the name of the complainant, which in a sexual misconduct case will eventually come to light if it's not obvious from the very beginning. And so I'm not overly concerned about these requirements because I believe it sets up the beginning of fundamental fairness and due process. Here's the allegation. And we move forward from there with investigation. We've already been working under the investigation guise of not being able to and shouldn't be asking students not to talk about things. So there's an awful lot of information that is already being spread between students and amongst students prior to a first meeting with an investigator. Again, I think this just sheds some light on fundamental fairness, and ultimately our goal is to provide equitable process for all parties, right? So, and that means everyone gets to know the same information.
But the way that it's worded, doesn't it appear at least that what is required would prohibit us from having educational conversations with accused parties in terms of perhaps an anonymous complaint that came in of that's of the nature of just sexual harassment? Couldn't that then preclude us down the line if we were to find out additional information from moving to an investigation?
You say anonymous complaint versus an anonymous report, right? So to me, complaint has a very specific language, and we have a responsibility if we're going to follow up on a complaint to have more details, not fewer, and certainly not an anonymous complaint. Anyone can make a report. Here's some concerning behavior that I just want you all to be aware of, and perhaps you could have a conversation, whether it's a student or we often get this in our bias incident response policy where someone will submit an anonymous online report of a troubling interaction. So for me, it's the word complaint. And if it's a complaint that someone is asking the college to look into and investigate, in terms of fairness and equity, more information is required and specific.
Jill, did you have something?
I'm just thinking through what Larry's talking about, and with the opening of the opportunity for informal resolution, which gives us some flexibility on if the institution takes the complaint to a formal adjudication process and investigation process versus this informal road. I see a lot of different ways that this could play out, and I think we're going to have to see some examples or of times that institutions did this really well and times that institutions made some missteps in order to really figure out how this will play out. Again, I think we're 3 days post-mortem on this letter, and it's too soon to make some of these calls, and we can speculate, but I'd rather wait and see what happens.
Fair enough. Does anyone have any comments on the footnote 19 about evaluating sexual misconduct with the standard that may be used in other student misconduct cases?
We have, there are a number of institutions that changed their burdens of proof when the 2011 guidance came out. And so there are some student conduct processes out in the world where clear and convincing or some other standard is used for their everyday student conduct process, but then preponderance of the evidence was used for the sexual misconduct process or the Title IX related process. So I think it's interesting that they kind of come out and say, if you use clear and convincing, use clear and convincing. If you use preponderance, but don't make the standards different based on the type of case. ASCA is a big proponent of the preponderance of the evidence standard because it does promote fairness and equity for both parties. I know that there are a couple of other professional organizations that are also promoting the preponderance of evidence standard as the most equitable standard for these processes. But I do think that, I am aware of some institutions where clear and convincing is codified by their state legislature because they're a public institution, and changing those things is very, very difficult. So I'm interested to see where this goes. I know that there's, other organizations that have created their own versions of what the standards of evidence should look like, but ultimately preponderance is the better practice. But this, I think, allows for some consistency and, again, deference to individual institutions.
Larry or Wanda, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, on my campus, we use the preponderance standard for all student conduct cases, or whether gender-based misconduct or an academic integrity or use of drinking, inappropriate use of drinking or alcohol in residence halls or something like that. So it is not a conflict in our current policy that we'd have to manage going forward. I do think that it is I think the public debate on this will be very interesting. I'm actually keenly interested to hear the arguments, particularly for campuses. I came from a campus for which clear and convincing was the academic integrity standard. And so I suspect that there are a number of campuses that use different evidentiary standards, and achieving some level of consistency may make sense, but I certainly believe in the preponderance standard.
I think, yes, of course I do as well. And that was one of the first disappointments that it is just more of this. I feel like that as institutional systems in general, I think that we were all, when we were moving under the previous guidance, and the questions were always more clarity, like, and this, I think overall is just a complete turnaround, right? Even with the standard of evidence, it comes off, honestly, a lot of the measures in place come off a little wishy-washy to me. It's like, well, you do, but you got, and you can, but you will, And so for I think that this is one. I know our institution, as it relates to adjudicating cases of sexual misconduct, we also utilize preponderance of evidence, and that is something that I am also a big supporter and proponent of as well.
With regard to the policies and the differences between a sexual misconduct policy and other codes of conduct, one of our attendees has asked that and referred to a footnote in the new question and answers document. And the quote in the question is, when a school applies special procedures in sexual misconduct cases, it suggests a discriminatory purpose and should be avoided. The question is, has this raised any flags for any of you that schools will be discouraged from having a separate sexual misconduct process?
Read that last part again, Tanya.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The question is, has this footnote, the one with regard to when a school applies special procedures in sexual misconduct cases, it suggests a discriminatory purpose and should be avoided. Has this particular footnote raised any flags for you that schools may be discouraged, or the OCR may in the future discourage schools from having separate sexual misconduct processes from the regular code of conduct process?
The 2014 and 2011 guidance, which again has since been rescinded, had always stated that we could use our existing student conduct processes to adjudicate Title IX cases. So many institutions were doing that as well. But as far as the footnote is concerned, it's not something that we've had a chance to dig into at this point in time. So I'm not fully prepared to comment on kind of the outlook on that.
Yeah, I guess Jill is a much better politician than I am, and much more diplomatic, I should say. Politician could be a dirty word. I guess I would say often gender-based misconduct has to be, to use a term Tanya used, survivor-centric and trauma-informed. And that's different than other forms of misconduct on campus. And so I'm not concerned about using a trauma-informed process for something for which it's required. And that's different than other forms of misconduct where the level of trauma is either much lower or completely absent.
I also think that begs the question of training of the professionals that are doing the work, right? And one of the things that we focus on in the student conduct profession is really sound training. We offer trauma-informed investigation training to our conduct officers, and we expect that our conduct officers are up on the latest practices. They're up on what being a trauma-informed investigator really means, or a trauma-informed adjudicator. So for me, I guess I didn't say it out loud because it's so ingrained as part of our best practices.
Right.
So it's part of who we are as conduct officers. And although we might be using the same procedures, the sensitivity of the person doing the adjudication, we still want them to have that training in place before they sit with a person who's experienced a trauma or is being accused of perpetrating a trauma.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Great answers. I just, when the answers just, yeah.
Well, I'd like to. We are just about out of time. For those attendees whose questions we did not get to, I apologize for that. All of us on this panel will be available after or individually to answer any questions you may have, at least from our point of view. And NASPA had asked me to remind all of you that this session has been recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards. And then again, just want to thank everyone, Lawrence, Wanda, and Jill for your time and expertise on this panel. Thank you so much.
Nice to be with you.
Take care.
I know.
Thank you all so much for attending, and thanks to our panelists. And as Tanya mentioned, the recording will be up on the Online Learning Center in about a week. So thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.